Hi, I'm Cindy Friedman. I am on the SACWA board currently, and I also serve on the Education Committee. And I am here today to talk to my good friend, Ann Johnston, who has been in the quilt world for a long, long time. I know I met you in Houston a long time ago, like 25 years ago.
Yes.
You're still a very contemporary voice in the quilt world, which I think is pretty amazing. You keep reinventing yourself and
Mhm.
doing lots of wonderful things. I'm going to give you a little bit of a formal introduction here. Ann Johnston makes art quilts with her hand-dyed fabrics and freehand stitched and are shown all over the world. Her books, workshops, and lectures about dyeing and designing have been resources for fiber artists for many years. Her growing mastery of color and texture continues to produce powerful work that entrances viewers and collectors from all walks of life. And without further ado, Ann, tell us why you like cotton.
Well, I've been using cotton mostly for my quilts since when I started. And what I'd like to communicate today is that there are lots of kinds of cotton, and some of them serve different purposes for us. I don't know everything about cotton. I don't know everything about all the kinds of cotton, but I have specific ideas about what I need when I'm making a quilt, when I'm dyeing the fabric. These are pieces of fabric on my table. The folded ones are sorted by what kind they are. I can tell by looking closely, but it's easier to have them stacked up individually. The wrinkled up ones on the table are getting ready to be put in a basin of soda ash solution, which is the fixative for the dyes. And after I have it in the basin, they're all wet, I put it in the washing machine, I spin it out, and then I line dry them. So the ones you see on the line, they're 1 yard pieces. I'm getting them all ready for some teaching samples. And I will be dyeing some of them when they're dry. I may take some of the ones that don't have soda on them and wet them. And I'm going to look at the different kinds of textures and how they affect the dyeing that I do. That's what I'd like to talk about today. I gave a workshop a long time ago. I was bringing fabric to my students because I wanted to make sure they had good fabric. And I started to say, well, when you come to class, bring the fabric you would like to dye, and I'll take samples. I took samples from each person. Some people had several different kinds of fabric they were dyeing. And these are 2 samples from a batch. They were in a basin together. I poured the same color on them. I stirred them the same way. I put the soda on the same, and I let them sit the same length of time. I took them out and washed them. The one on the right is a sample that I brought because I knew it would dye nicely and show the colors brightly. And the one on the left is one of the student samples that we all decided we didn't want to dye anymore. And that happens in every class. There's something that doesn't come out well, but the thing that we found that was really shocking is she bought this on a bolt in a fabric store, and the end of the bolt said "to dye for." The manufacturer was selling this with that name on it, hoping that people would use it for dyeing. So just because it's white and it looks nice, it doesn't mean it will dye well. It's a lesson that I've taught in all of my workshops over the years. Here I have a picture of 6 pieces of fabric that really at a glance, they look a lot the same. I've labeled them so you can see these 6 are my trusted standards. I use them many times on a lot of my quilts. They're not the only kind of fabric, cotton, I use, but they are the standards that I would bring and put in a test bath, for dye bath, for example. Where you see RK, it means Robert Kaufman. They have a really wonderful sateen. Test Fabrics 419 is one of my standbys. Very firm, somewhat opaque, tightly woven. broadcloth. The Pimatex by Robert Kaufman, their PFD also dyes in a similar way to the test fabrics. It's similar in weight and weave. And then the Patina PFD is very similar to the Hoffman. The Hoffman, I call it a lawn. They're lighter weight, they're a little more transparent, but they dye differently than the other heavier cottons. And the last one on the list is 400M. It is a cotton print cloth that has an even weave. It's not very tightly woven. The M means mercerized. And I think I made my first 100 quilts with this fabric because I was hand quilting. And some of the others are not quite as easy to get the needle through. So you'll see more about that as I show you pictures. This is what I would tell you to do if you had some fabric and you didn't know if it dyes well. Take one of the ones that I'm telling you works well, or another one you have tested in another place, or if it has a given name that you know it works, put it in a dye bath, a little bucket. You can do 8-inch square pieces or 10-inch squares. It's hard to wash little tiny strips. And the strips go down the drain too. But anyway, you can see the piece that we would not want to dye anymore. It isn't worth it. You could dye that piece over and over again, and it will never get as dark as those others. If you dyed them over, they might get darker or change color, but they would never compare to each other. Another couple of things about different kinds of cotton. These are 3 pieces. They're not washed. They're just folded in half, and I put some water on top of them. And the 2 on the left, the water absorbed right in. They're both white. They're not the same color white, but this is how they're starting out. And the one on the right, the water did not absorb in. It just sat there. Maybe it will dye well if I get it to wet in and, poke it a lot. Maybe it would soak in if I washed it first. But in any case, it is a yellow fabric. It is a natural color fabric. And one of the things I prefer to dye white fabric because you have the potential of getting the brightest colors you can possibly get with whites. But if you start with a tan or a yellowish cotton, that will always have that color under it, and all the colors will be affected by that. So I find that I can't get bright colors with the natural colored cotton, but I can dull, if I want natural colors and dull down colors, I can dye the white and make it that way. So that's the way I look at it. Here you have, on the right, you have a piece of cotton. It was a white cotton, but it didn't wet out. And the other one, they were in the same basin together. And on the one on the right, it's pretty dark color, it's pretty bright, but it would have been a lot of work to get the dye really to absorb and to spread in a way that I tend to like. Here's another test. The fabric number 5, I bought that from a vendor in Houston. I think it might have been from, it's definitely imported. I think it might have been from Africa. It had a wonderful texture to it. It was woven. Both sides had a texture. And I really wanted to dye it. It was very stiff. So what I did is I washed it. I scoured it in really, really hot water with Synthrapol, which is a detergent that helps scour out stuff that's on the fabric. Number 1, number 2, and number 4 were fabrics that dye well, but you see there's a variety in the colors. And number 3 is another swatch that I threw in the bucket just to compare. And it would be on my list. I would write down the name of it and I would make a note not to ever use it. But the number 5, it softened up as I washed it and I was able to use it. Even though it's a slightly different color, it's a little more similar to the color in number 1. All righty, so I'm still working with dye concentrate that's in liquid form. These are a couple samples I made for my current teaching samples. On the left is 400M. It's the print cloth that has a kind of an open weave, and the one on the right is 419. They're both a flat weave. The dye flows in them and through them, and the colors will separate depending on which colors you use. But if you look at the one on the right, you see how much farther it went and how uniformly it flowed compared to the one on the left. I did another comparison here with different kinds of weaves. You can see I've labeled it on the top. On the left, it's 400M. I put the same amount of dye in the brush, and I put the same amount in the center with a spoon on each of these samples. And the straight weave flows the most, and the sateen weave really slows down the flowing of the colors. And the one on the right is a t-shirt, and it doesn't go hardly anywhere. It's wonderful. I mean, I literally poured on the same amount of dye in the center of all of those. And knowing that makes it easier for me to understand why things are happening with the fabric on my table or in my basins. And I might think about it before I choose which fabric. So this was a detail of a yard of 400M. It's that open print cloth. And the dye, it's folded tightly, it's put in a basin, it's a low water immersion dye process. But without the stirring, the dye can flow naturally into the open spaces. And this effect wouldn't have been the same if I'd done it on a piece of sateen, for example. Here's a piece. This is it's either the Pimatex or the 419. I'm not sure which, but it is a piece of dry, soda soaked fabric, and I painted the dye on with no thickener. So where you see the halos flowing out, they're flowing out because it is a style of weave that allows the dye to flow more. And if I leave space for the dye to flow and I mix in different colors with each other, I will get different colored halos. And here's one of our family projects. We'd like to spray t-shirts. We go outside. I brought them in here in my dye studio to keep warm so they'll cure. But if we were going to spray all of this dye onto a flat piece of cotton, we wouldn't have had all the white areas because the dye on the t-shirt just stops. And there's no thickener in it. The thickener won't go through a spray bottle, basically. So, but even the little speckles don't bleed out because it's a t-shirt weave. Now this is a corner of a yard of cotton. It's sateen. I don't know if you can tell by the shine on it or the selvage. You can also see that it's got quite a fraying edge there. It's a heavier cotton sateen. And I learned that if I poured dye onto a thicker style fabric, I had more opportunity to spread it with my gloves and blend the colors. I literally pour it on and blend. And as time went by, I practiced and practiced, and I figured out how to do this. This is a 9-foot piece of cotton sateen. It isn't the heavier cotton, it's sateen. It's slightly lighter weight, which made it more work. And I was nervous about this, but I got ready. I lined up all the values of the color. Then I got my gloves on. I started pouring and mixing as fast as I could. And it came out pretty evenly. It isn't something you're going to do the first time you try this, but the sateen weave helps me be able to control the flow. So this is about a yard of the Hoffman maybe, or the patina. I'm not sure which now, but the whole yard of fabric I put it on the tube, and in the traditional manner, I wrapped string around it and scrunched it all together so it's fit on this big round tube, and I am putting the dye on it, placing it. I have no idea what it will look like because, of course, the fabric is circled around and around itself, and you can see the edge here of where it is overlapping. So I think twice about this because if I have a heavyweight cotton, it will come out differently. This is another piece with just plain navy poured on it. And I would not be able to get this tight, crisp, linear look if I had a coarser, heavier fabric. This is probably the patina. So I don't always just pour the dye on. Most frequently I'm painting it on, or I'm putting it on with rollers, or I'm putting it on with stamps. The table here, I'm working on a project. I'm mixing blacks. I'm using orange and navy. It makes wonderful blacks and grays. But I want to make sure I'm painting a quilt that's going to be 7 feet tall. And I want to make sure that the colors are as dark as I want and as light as I want. So what you see here, this is one piece of fabric that I have cut a small piece off the edge. And I just move it aside. And this other piece has been washed in hot water and detergent. So I can then, when they're dry, I can put them up together and I can say, yes, no, that's gray, that's not too dark, that's browner, the brown isn't too orange. I can see that, in fact, it's what I expect. I expect that what I dyed on the dry fabric, after I wash it, I expect it to look like it did before I washed it. And there's not too many tricks in order to do that. I have the list over here. You need the soda ash. You need the fabric to be at least 70 degrees room temperature. You need a tiny bit of moisture in it. So literally I cover these swatches if I know I'm going to test them. I cover them with a little plastic, and you need at least 4 hours of time for the dye to really work. Then I get the results I expect. Now, a variable could be if my fabric, it isn't a good fabric, or if my dye is old. I mean, there's other things that can go on. I want you to notice this little kind of anonymous little gadget right there. That is my thermometer. And even when I teach, I bring a thermometer with me because I want to know how warm the room is. It will affect the dye. It may be just slightly less color, but in any case, I always have it there. So when I'm painting, this is a nice, smooth, lightweight piece of cotton, not too absorbent. I'm able to paint with, I painted it with this brush. But before I painted it, I used the bottle with black dye in it, and I did the curlicues. So all of those I put directly on the white cotton. And before they even dried completely, I started painting over it. I was doing it with a camera watching me, and I was in a hurry. If I had waited for this black, some of the parts of the black are a little bit fuzzy because they were still wet when I painted over them. But the dye starts fixing, and the fabric was smooth and the dye had thickener. So it's really, you can do quite a lot of different things. I tend to like, in this case, I used the heavier 419 broadcloth because it's crisp, it's opaque, and I can do all kinds of linear work. It doesn't wrinkle as much when I'm working across it. And I can get lots of kind of precise edges, what I like. Now, this is a detail of a small piece of fabric. I was actually doing it to see if I wanted to do a bigger piece. And you're looking at it after it was dry, before I washed it. So you literally see the wrinkles that are in the fabric. But it's important that the fabric is smooth, because those are 1/8 inch strips of masking tape. And they're the little self-adhesive dots you can buy in a stationery store. So if they don't stick down, if the fabric is lumpy or bumpy, then you don't, the mask that they are, the masking tape or the dot, the dye will go under them. And all the rest of the texture is, by the way, it's just the texture that was on my roller when I rolled across it. It's not the fabric. Okay. Now, I have been practicing making stencils of tiny little designs. These dots on the, you can see on the left side, it's a piece of transparent plastic stencil material. And I've cut out, they're about 1/4 inch average dots, because I want to make granite. I want to dye granite. I want it to be all over, lots of speckles. I don't want to paint each one of these. But I found that the roller did a wonderful job, but the fabric I was using was the sateen, a heavy sateen, and it was so absorbent that I really had to press to get the dye in. And many of the little dots where I lifted up were not completely black, because the fabric required more dye penetrating to keep it black. Anyway, so in this case, I might have been better off using a less absorbent cotton. Now, this took me a long time to figure out. I've been playing with potato dextrin for years and years and years. There's a lot of variety possible with it. On the piece on the left, you see all the wrinkles in the white. That's the fabric. When the dextrin dried, and it cracks. As it dries, it cracks naturally. You don't have to do anything to it. It just shrinks in and cracks. And then the piece on the right, you can see it's done. I painted it over with a dark navy dye, and everywhere the dextrin wasn't, the dye went through, and you can see the large crackles and the small crackles. You can see the places where there wasn't any dextrin. But what I found out is that if you have a very thick, soft cotton, it doesn't crack the same. And I did yards and yards of wonderful, very softly cracked cottons that didn't have as much crackle, because I didn't really realize that I don't get that sharp edge if the fabric is drapey, thicker sateen, or one of the other kinds of cotton I use. This is not just potato dextrin, by the way. The potato dextrin, I applied it over the greens, then the dextrin, then the really dark blackish color. So layers and layers. Another place I discovered that was important to have a heavier fabric is for monoprinting. I mean, it's not required, but it makes life easier. In the upper left corner, you see the dye, thickened dye is spread on a plastic surface, and it's bubbling off. And I literally spooned it on and brushed it on, put it on with a squeeze bottle. And then the lower picture is where I put a piece of sateen, my heavier sateen, on top of the dye, and it's ready to pick it up. And I'm pressing it in and making sure I get some of the marks. You could do this with thinner fabric, and I have done it, but it comes out completely differently because it just spreads so fast and absorbs right in through the back. The next picture is a picture of the fabric after I picked it up. You know, at first I spread the dye a little bit on the back of the fabric. Then I picked it up, I let it cure, and I washed it. And this is what I had. And it was probably, well, on my wall in every orientation possible for over a year before I decided to make this quilt out of it. And you see the cotton sateen. One of the things I realized I really liked about it is that it would fray nicely. It had a nice little fluffy edge. This is literally laid on top. What do you call it? Raw edge, sewed down. However, my background colors, they were a broadcloth that they didn't fray at all. And they're really, everything is put together with the raw edge, including my dots. I took the same color navy that I had in the monoprint, and this is raw edge applique over the border here. And they have little tiny frayed edges, which seems like it's a good thing to with something that's a spill or a dot or something. So the sateen is what helps it also. That's the quilting show because it glows. So just to review, I dye fabric because I make quilts. Mostly that's the reason why. And I've been doing it a long time, made a lot of quilts. I've learned a lot about my fabrics. These are a lighter weight sateen I've dyed particularly for a project. The project is here. I printed it up on the computer. It's a design that matches this one almost, not exactly the same. But I literally made pattern pieces. They're on my table here. These are some of the pattern pieces. And I'm going to make a full-size quilt out of those colors that I planned using my computer. And the main reason I'm using this kind of fabric is because it has a glow and the quilting shows. Also, it's a little tighter weave sateen, so it doesn't fray as much, because all of my construction in the quilts that you see in the last many years is raw edge applique. Here's a picture of the two quilts. I had 25 quilts. I shipped them in 7 boxes to France to be in the Carrefour European. And I was just thrilled to be there. And they hung my quilts. Some of them you could see the front and back, but beyond the one in the middle, you can see the 2 Cirque mountain quilts. And here's another exhibit with a few more of my quilts. It's really thrilling to see them shown with such respect and with an audience that wants to know more and walks and looks at every part of it and asks questions. The Nevada Museum of Art did a wonderful job for my exhibit. So I'm just about done here. I just wanted to show you the books that I have written and published that are still available. The little yellow one in the middle, Color by Accident, I published that in the late 90s. And 15 years later, decided it was time to teach people what I know, what I learned in those 15 years. So Color by Accident is still available free on my website as a download. The entire book, cover to cover, every page of it is copied in a PDF and you can download it for free. The other book, Color by Design, is the second edition. I've updated it from the first at some point. And last year, I decided it was time to show how I do this in motion and not just in pictures. So I had this wonderful team of photographers come to my house, my studio, and I prepared scripts and handouts and samples, and they used the cameras that made it look like you could see what was going on. And we spent a couple weeks doing this. I'm thrilled to have it out there. I have a pair of pieces of information in print and in the video format. If you are interested, or if you want to just see what it's all about, you can go directly to my website, or you can go to this platform where I am storing the quilts that you can find if you would like to look at them. That's all I have to say about cotton this morning.
Well, that was fabulous. Thank you so much. I actually have some questions for you. Sometimes you piece and sometimes you seem to paint a whole cloth. I would call it a whole cloth quilt.
Yes.
What's the ratio and why do you change back and forth?
So I do call them whole cloth quilts. And when I decide that it's going to be a whole cloth quilt, it is a project that's different, completely different in process. Sometimes a whole cloth quilt, I have done pieces where I literally put the dial over the table and I printed an 8-foot piece of cotton 5 or 6 times before I got one that I wanted to be. Other times I might draw the whole design out and I can put the paper on my table and a piece of clear vinyl and the cloth, and I can see my lines and their guides. And I would paint within, you know, my plan. The way I decide whether or not I'm going to piece it or applique it or paint the whole thing is by what I feel like doing. It's just at that moment. There are so many jobs and so many parts of making a quilt. You know, am I going to immersion dye? Am I going to paint? Am I going to get into it? You know, the one I'm working on right now on the wall behind me, I did something I've never done before. I did machine applique, tiny little pieces all over it. You know, so I do the job the way I think I can get it done best, and also fitting the mood I'm in. Sometimes I feel like painting. Sometimes I feel like putting this raw edge applique is more like a collage. And as far as how many, I can't count what the ratio is.
Sure.
It's the job that needs to be done.
When you're doing low immersion dyes, though, you tend to use smaller, more manageable sized pieces, like a yard at a time.
Well, when I was doing a lot of that, I did 2-yard pieces because I'm greedy, and quilts are big. Quilts are big, you know, and I found that as teaching workshops, I come home with mountains of fat quarters. And I can use those to audition or to see what I want or use it somewhere. But when I really want a color, I might need a big piece. For my recent series of quilts in the contact, I went to my stash as a guide for colors, and then I would go to my dye table and dye them. And I've dyed whole cloth queen size backs.
Wow.
I have one of the satines I buy is 120 inches wide.
Wow.
Yeah, but it's a different, situation. It's not a little yogurt container.
Yeah. Well, of course, the piece that I lusted after was the 8 yards of I would call it an ombre, where it was the cotton sateen and it went from a pale blue to a really rich dark blue. And I work with a lot of silk ombres, obviously. And I thought it was seamless. It was like a perfect transition. And that's impressive to me.
Well, it's taken practice. And as I said, I chose the fabric accordingly. I want to tell you that if I put silk charmeuse on the table, it would be much more difficult, because one of the characteristics of silk is that the minute, the second the dye hits it, it starts faster. It's just a faster, more receptive fiber. So it might have to be done a different way than that.
And if you were going to work on silk, would you work it from the back or from the front side?
That is a really good question. And I discovered the answer quite by accident. The side that's facing the table gets bubbles on it, but it also gets the most color because it's literally in contact with the dye more than all of the surface that's in contact with the air. So I've learned to put my satines face down on the table and just make sure I spread out all the bubbles. And yeah, I actually did a whole quilt. I was really excited about the whole technique. It was it was like 90 inches long by 6 feet wide. And I put the sateen side up and I put it on my wall and I washed it. I had to do it all over again because the shiny side was what I wanted. And most of the dye is sitting on the table surface.
Huh. So you work on a table that's got an impervious, it's covered with plastic or vinyl?
Yeah, it's called, well, I work on different surfaces, but the one you see in this picture, can you still see it?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's called white marine vinyl. It is a heavy weight and it's backed with like a knit surface. So I used to work on a very hard, like enamel painted board surface, but the paint scrapes off. And then vinyl can get a hole in it eventually, but I can literally wipe it off with a cloth. And once in a while, I put it in the washing machine on a gentle.
That's so interesting.
Yeah.
The only way I've seen lots of yardage done, it's been pinned around the edges, like almost through a soft padded surface that's covered with something that's impermeable or like a canvas kind of cloth. I've never seen it done where you don't anchor the fabric.
A lot of the kind of fabric surface design you see is done with paint. And when you put a stamp on a piece of cotton and stamp a paint design, it may go through a little bit, depends on your cotton, right? But if it goes through, it hits the surface, the canvas. And then the paint turns to plastic and it's okay. But with dye, when you stamp with dye, it depends again on how much the quantity is. It will penetrate a little bit, at least, the cotton, and then it gets on the canvas. And then the next time you put a piece of cloth down to paint on it, the dye comes back up into the fabric. So I've taught in many art schools and so on, and their printing tables are usually canvas with paint all over them from all the old prints, but it doesn't come back. I find that distracting because when all the fabrics are transparent to some degree, and I put a piece of white fabric on a colored surface and I can see all those colors, And then it's distracting to my eye.
Yeah, yeah. This might be a really newbie kind of beginner question because I don't paint or dye. What does PFD stand for?
I was thinking I should go back to that. The prepared for dyeing are three words that mean PFD, prepared for dyeing. However, traditionally and in the past, it was used to mean the fabric had no sizing in it. The sizing is a starch. It's used in the weaving process. It may even be put on at the end to make it prettier in the store. And that prevents the dye from going through it. So there are fabrics out there that say they're PFD. That means that there's no sizing on them. It does not mean that it will dye well. And in the case of Robert Kaufman, they have created a line of fabrics that for dyers, basically. So when I talk about their Pimatex or their patina, you want to buy the Pimatex with the letters PFD after it, and the letters PD, the letters on the Pimatex and the patina. In the case of Robert Kaufman, it means they have been causticized and they are more receptive to the dye and they're more reflective, and the colors reflect to our eyes and they look brighter. If you buy Pimatex without the PFD after it, they sell that too, because a lot of people don't care about dyeing the cotton and the process costs more for them to produce. So I had a friend who came to my house one day. She had 20 yards of cotton dyed in the backseat of her car, just thrown in the backseat of her car, not even folded up. And she said, what happened? What's wrong? What am I doing wrong? And it was Pimatex, but it wasn't Pimatex PFD. They were beautiful pastels. And she said, I've dyed them twice right already. And should I dye them again? I said, no. Enjoy them as pastels because they're not going to get any darker. And it's confusing, very confusing, because those letters don't really mean that it's ready for you to dye. It is ready in the sense it doesn't sizing on it. But Robert Kaufman is doing the same thing that Test is. They're creating fabrics that Test Fabrics is doing. They're creating fabrics that are ready for people to use and be successful with in dyeing fabrics. Got it.
You used another term that I'm not familiar with, and it's urea water. What is urea water?
When you mix a dye, you start with a powder and then you mix a thickener or to paint it on with, or some kind of a medium, because I mix a dye very, very concentrated, and I might want it to be a light color, or I might want to thicken it. Urea is one of the components in the thickening, thickener or thickened paste. It is a moisturizing agent. It is just a granular product, little white dots, and they make the fabric hold moisture. They're used, actually, it's used in our hand lotions, a lot of cosmetics. If you look at it, you may see urea it's also used on fertilizer on the fields, but it is in order to keep moisture in, because if the dye dries, bone dry, it can't react. The molecules can't move around.
So when you say you leave the dye in place, you cover it so that it doesn't evaporate, so the moisture stays in the cloth?
I make sure it stays moist for at least 4 hours. My rule of thumb is I wait overnight before I think about washing it. The amount of moisture influences the control. So if I have a piece of fabric like the monoprint of the wave quilt, it's just completely soggy, covered with thickened dye, I might not cover that at all. It also depends on your climate. I mean, when I teach in a very, very dry climate, Colorado, in the high elevation, Arizona, the fabric was drying at lunchtime, so we cover it. If you want it to really blur and move, you cover it right away. So all of those are variables, but many, many pieces I don't cover at all, because they're not going to dry in the length of time it takes.
I got it. So it's been a treasure trove of information and learning for me, and you might actually interest me in learning to play with dyes. June,
I'm not trying to convert you.
Ann?
I think a lot of people just think when they're doing this and it didn't work, it was their fault. And in the case of cotton, I have found that 90% of the time it is the cotton and not the way the person was doing it. Yeah.
Yeah, I do have a question. Your friend who had all the fabric in her car, you said your advice to her was to enjoy them as pastels. So does that mean for some reason she couldn't have taken that cotton back home and scoured it and then dyed it and got more color to attach?
Because it wasn't sizing particularly. It was also the fact that it wasn't mercerized or cross-stitched. Those are two terms that are, they both refer to the fact that fabric has been treated with a caustic alkali. And what that does is it just goes in the fibers and makes them round. And they can accept more dye, and they also are very much more reflective. So it's a little bit like the difference between putting a color in your printer and putting a plain piece of paper in and putting a shiny piece of paper in your printer. So the more reflective the fabric is, and mercerization and causticization, however you say that, they are similar processes that help us as dyers get the most brilliance we can out of the fabrics.
Right. So if a cotton is mercerized, were you to unintentionally scour it before you dyed it, say it got mixed up, would it then not take the dye as well?
No.
It would, it's a permanent thing in the cloth?
Yeah, and in fact, some of that process happens, it depends on the mill and the place and their procedures, and I don't know that much about it, but it happens early on in the fiber, and it happens to the fiber. You know, it isn't a surface treatment. It goes right into the molecules of the fiber and swells them up. Yeah, I can't wash that out. And there's a lot of other treatments you can't wash out either. I mean, if you ever were going to dye fabric on wrinkle-free treatments, those you can't wash out. Sizing is usually referring to something that's a lot like a starch that will dissolve in hot water and soap.
Right. No, I mean, I've done a bit of dyeing, nothing like the amount that you've done, Anne, but I'm conscious of all these different variables. And I wonder, how long would you recommend people keep Procyon MX dyes expecting good results? And at what point do you look at the date on the tub and go, this is probably well past its best before date. I'd maybe be better to just turn it into, you know, put some water with it and use it to paint on paper.
Well, the bottom line is, whatever you've done, if you washed it in 140-degree water and detergent, that's what you have. That should be okay. I want to stick with what the industry says, which is the powders, which I buy, have a shelf life. And most of them are about 2 years. When I buy it, I put the date on the jar, and I don't stop using it. If it's like 2.5 years old or 3 years old, if it's an important project, I am going to test it.
Right.
And I've shown you a couple of ways to test how the dye works. Once I have mixed it with water, I'm very careful, and I would only use dye mixed with water. I keep it refrigerated, by the way, because that slows down the chemical action. If you keep it out at room temperature, the dye in the water will just start to react with the water. And eventually it'll look like the same color, but when you put it on the fabric, it'll look like the same color. But when you wash it, it will go, a lot will go away. So with those, I do some t-shirt spraying and things like, but one time I did that with a sweatshirt for my son. I made him a red sweatshirt, and it came out pink. You know, so and I did one huge piece of fabric once. I was using old blue, and I was creating greens of every color for a meadow, and the blues washed out. My greens were very yellow green. So I soaked it all and sewed it again, and I mixed fresh blue, and I painted it green again.
So would you very often over dye a piece of fabric, Anne?
Yes, I do that all the time. I have so much fabric, it's, but some of the pieces I have are a solid color and I set them aside because I want to print on them. Most of the time I'm printing on white and then I will over dye them a background color. And a lot of the prints I've made, it's a whole bucket full of pieces of fabric that I consider not done yet. That's the way I call it. And I may print over them. I may immersion dye them. I may get a roller. I may put dextrin on them. Yes, I over dye a lot. And it's another kind of practice because if you're putting color over color, they're transparent. So if you have a yellow piece of fabric and you want to make a blue sky over here, you are not going to get any blue. You're going to get green.
Mhm.
So there's ways to teach yourself by painting on the edge of a piece of fabric and seeing what it looks like after it kind of soaks in a little bit. I'd love to go on and on.
I have one more question and then
Okay.
my list is pretty much answered. How do you dispose of unused mixed up dye?
Okay, well, I'm a person with an English major. I have a master's degree in geography. I don't make this stuff up. I ask the chemists. And the chemists that I often refer to are at Pro Chemical and Dye in Massachusetts. And their directions are that it isn't going to harm any sewage system. It should just go right down the drain. When I was doing before low water immersion dyeing, for every pound of fabric, you had a pound of salt. And
Wow.
salt is toxic and it kills. If you throw the dye bath out in the yard, it'll kill the plants. And I stopped using salt because apparently you don't need to use any salt when you have such a low proportion of the dye to fabric. So they're saying it's safe to pour into any commercial sewage system. I have used it in every country in the world I've taught and every place. Now, if you were using wax or if you're using a lot of potato dextrin, you don't want to clog up the drains and all.
Hmm. Wow, that was fabulous. Thank you
Well,
so much for sharing
happy
your
to
knowledge
share.
about cotton.